Yes, I'm running ads at the very start because get them the hell out of the way. Hey, where am I? There I am. Cool. Hey, Red Wolf. Thank you for coming in and lurking. I always do appreciate my lurkers. Oh, it actually went to the right caption. It's nice of Stream Elements to actually post the right one. Okay. And the annoying commercial break is over. Cool. Oop. Sam's on. Where is he? I don't know if Sam's actually on or not. I never get notifications about people being on anymore. It's really annoying. I'm not hearing myself. There's something up with that. What is it about me not hearing myself lately? I mean, the volume's up. There it is. Okay, now I can hear myself. Okay. Why am I floating above the thing so much? Did I do that? Just pain sometimes. Okay, much better. Let's see. Okay. Fairly situated on that screen. Okay. But hey, it is Friday. Welcome. We have survived. It is time for Friday Night Fairy Tales. For those of you who like fairy tales, those who don't, well, by all means, feel free to lurk anyway. See if these work. Just for the hell of it. And no, it did not. Sound alerts! What the hell can happen in 24 hours that it will suddenly stop working again? Like that. Why? Why sound alerts? Why? Explain it to me. It's just bloody annoying. Oh well. Why is it not showing me my friends that are on? So how can I heckle my favorite kitty boy if he's not showing up as being on? I mean, Pink Steel's on. I'm lurking in his channel right now. Why is it not showing me if Sammy's on or not? That is crazy weirdness. That's what Kieran's doing. Reading you moon. Interesting. I'm going to make a quick sound alert. Sammy's chat. Since sound alerts aren't working in here, it really does make me wonder what is going on with my sound alerts that I can't get chat to work. Is this gonna work? I hear not the woo. Okay. And Neko Mom is coming on. He's doing a partner push right now. Anyway, it's 9:02. I've still got a few minutes before we get into the reading, so just seeing how everyone's doing and what's up with the week and all that fun, nifty stuff. You all survived, I hope. Who's that one? Okay. Close that elemental. Close that index. Close that owlbear. Try my other sound alerts if I can. Oh, I left that one on. Okay, I didn't hear that one either. I really wish I knew why my sound alerts could not stay constantly. I didn't change a damn thing since yesterday when they were working. It's just irritating. Just absolutely freaking irritating. To have to go to the freaking site and log on every damn time. That's just, I don't know. I really don't know why it doesn't want to work. I am, how many sets? 14 people away from the 250 follower goal? That's kind of cool. Okay. Okay. Everyone can play my alerts. That's cool. Okay. Channel points. I got the two things on that. Other alerts. My introduction ones. Okay, that's fine. Go to my library. I've Gotta list it's my favorites. Okay, that's done on the overlays. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Scenes. No scenes for that. Insights? No. Okay, I don't know why it just refuses to work. It's just... Why can I not get my settlers to actually play? It's gonna drive me crazy. I don't know what's causing it. But part of that, I don't know. I really don't know. What is a basculation? That's me in the spotlight. Not catching a basculation. Trying to keep up with you, and I don't know if I can do it. Oh no, I've sang too much. I better shut up now. Anyway, gonna go and switch over to the reading room, so there we go. Check it out. I better check my audio because... Oh, well. Let's restart that.
And the next branch unfolds into the darkness.
I turn into an owl and fly up to see what's ahead.
Okay. I almost hear the thunderstorm. Okay. There's the storm. I like hearing the storm. Okay, well, we've got 2 minutes left. Again, we are doing fairy tales from this wonderful book, Beauty and the Beast and Other Classic Fairy Tales, that I got at Barnes & Noble's. It's got a lot of stories in it. Let's try to see how many we can get through. Again, I usually only give myself 2 hours worth, so... And if I have any audio problems, try to send me a message so I know. But I do have water, and I would say I have coffee, but it's chocolate-covered coffee beans. Because, quite frankly, I like chocolate-covered coffee beans and starved chocolate, so I'm technically eating 2 things that wolves should not be eating. Because coffee has caffeine, and, you know, we're not supposed to have caffeine as wolves. But we're also not supposed to have dark chocolate. So as a wolf, I'm technically poisoning myself 2 ways. I don't want to like eating something that just ends up with me having coffee grounds in my mouth. But they're tasty. Anyway, it's after 9:10 now, so I guess I should get into the stories. Now that I've ground a coffee bean in my teeth. Glad you can't see them. But anyway. The first story tonight volume seems like it's still down a little. I know I'm not peeking out or anything. Raise my mic just a little bit more. Hello. Crank it up a little bit more. Hello? Hello, hello. I don't know why you say goodbye. Say hello. Okay, well. Make sure it's got the right microphone setting on here, because... Okay, does it. Yes, you are just in time. In fact, I haven't even said the name of the first story yet. Been too busy eating chocolate-covered espresso beans. But our first story for the night is The True Sweetheart from Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales. It may sound familiar. There was once on a time a girl who was young and beautiful, but she had lost her mother when she was quite a child, and her stepmother did all she could to make the girl's life wretched. Whenever this woman gave her anything to do, she worked at it indefatigably, and did everything that lay in her power. Still, she could not touch the heart of the wicked woman. By that, she was never satisfied. It was never enough. The harder the girl worked, the more work was put upon her, and all that the woman thought of was how to weigh her down with still heavier burdens and make her life still more miserable. One day she said to her, "Here 5 pounds of feathers, which thou must pick, and if they are not done this evening, thou mayest expect a good beating. Dost thou imagine thou art idle away the whole day?" The poor girl sat down to work, but tears ran down her cheeks as she did so, for she saw plainly enough that it was quite impossible to finish the work in one day. Whenever she had a little heap of feathers lying before her, and she sighed or smote her hands together in her anguish, they flew away. And she had to pick them out again and begin her work anew. Then she put her elbows on the table and laid her face in her 2 hands and cried, "Is there no one, then, on God's earth to have pity on me?" Then she heard a low voice which said, "Be comforted, my child. I have come to help thee." The maiden looked up, and an old woman was by her side. The girl took kindly one by the hand and said, "Only tell me what is troubling thee." And she spoke so kindly that the girl told her of her miserable life, and how one burden after another was laid upon her, and she never could get to the end of the work which was given to her.
If I have not done these feathers by this evening, my stepmother will beat me. She has threatened she will, and I know she keeps her word.
Her tears began to flow, and the good old woman said,
Do not be afraid, my child. Rest a while, and in the meantime I will look to thy work.
The girl lay down on her bed and soon fell asleep. Thank you. The old woman seated herself at the table with the feathers, and how did they fly off the quills, which she scarcely touched with her withered hands. The 12 pounds were soon finished, and when the girl awoke, great snow-white heaps were lying, piled up, and everything in the room was neatly cleared away. But the old woman had vanished. The maiden thanked God and sat still till evening came, when the stepmother came in and marveled to see the work completed.
Just look, you awkward creature, she said. What can be done when people are industrious, and why couldst thou not set about something else? There thou sittest with thy hands crossed.
When she went out, she said,
The creature is worth more than her salt. I must give her some work that is still harder.
And next morning she called the girl and said,
There is a spoon for thee. With that thou must empty out for the great pond which is beside the garden, and if it is not done by night, thou knowest what will happen.
The girl took the spoon and saw that it was full of holes. But even if it had not been, she could never have emptied the pond with it. She set to work at once, knelt down by the water into which her tears were falling, and began to empty it. But the good old woman appeared again, and when she learnt the cause of her grief, she said,
My dear good child, go to thy thicket and lie down and sleep. I will soon do thy work.
As soon as the old woman was alone, she barely touched the pond, and a vapor rose up on high from the water and mingled itself with the clouds. Gradually the pond was emptied, and when the maiden awoke before sunset and came thither, she saw nothing but the fishes which were struggling in the mud. She went to her stepmother and showed her that the work was done.
It ought to have been done long before this,
she said, and grew white with anger. But she meditated something new. On the third morning she said to the girl,
Thou must build me a castle on the plain there, and it must be ready by the evening.
The maiden was dismayed, and said,
How can I complete such work?
I will endure no opposition, screamed the stepmother.
If thou canst empty a pond with a spoon that is full of holes, thou canst build a castle too. I will take possessive of it this very day, and if anything is wanting, even if it be the most trifling thing in the kitchen or cellar, thou knowest what lies before you.
She drove the girl out, and when she entered the valley, the rocks were there, piled up one above the other, and all her strength would not have enabled her to even move the very smallest of them. She sat down and wept, and still she hoped the old woman would help her. The old woman was not long in coming, She comforted her and said, "Lie down there in the shade and sleep, and I will soon build the castle for thee. If it would be a pleasure to thee, thou canst live in it thyself." When the maiden had gone away, the old woman touched the gay rocks. They began to rise, and immediately moved together as if giants had built the walls, and on these the building arose, and it seemed as if countless hands were working invisibly, placing one stone upon another. There was a dull, heavy noise from the ground. Pillars arose of their own accord on high, and placed themselves in order near each other. The tiles laid themselves in order on the roof, and when noonday came, a great weathercock was already turning itself on the summit of the tower, like a golden figure of the Virgin with fluttering garments. The inside of the castle was being furnished while evening was drawing near. How the old woman managed it, I know not. But the walls of the rooms were hung with silk and velvet. Embroidered chairs were there, and richly ornamented armchairs by marble tables. Crystal chandeliers hung down from the ceilings, and mirrored themselves in a smooth pavement. Green parrots were in gilt cages, and so were strange birds which sang most beautifully. And there was on all sides as much magnificence as if a king were going to live there. Just as the sun was setting when the girl awoke, and the brightness of 1,000 lights flashed in her face, she hurried to the castle and entered by the open door. The steps were spread with red cloth, and the golden balustrade beset with flowering trees. When she saw the splendor of the apartment, she stood as if she turned to stone. Who knows how long she might have stood there if she had not remembered the stepmother. "Alas," she said to herself, "if she could not be satisfied at last, and would give up making my life a misery to me." The girl went and told her that the castle was ready. "I will move into it at once," she said, and rose from her seat. When they entered the castle, she was forced to hold her hand before her eyes. The brilliancy of everything was so dazzling. "Thou seest," she said to the girl, "how easy it has been for thee to do this. I ought to have given thee something harder." She went through all the rooms and examined every corner to see if anything was wanting or defective, but she could not discover anything. "Now we will go down below," said she, looking at the girl with malicious eyes. "The kitchen and the cellar still have to be examined, and if thou hast forgotten anything, thou shalt not escape thy punishment." But the fire was burning on the hearth, and the meat was cooking in the pan. The tongs and shovel were leaning against the wall, and the shining brazen utensils were arranged in sight. Nothing was wanting, not even a coal box or a water pail. "Which is the way to the cellar?" she cried. "If that is not abundantly filled, it shall go ill with thee." She raised herself up at the trap-door and descended, but she had hardly made 2 steps before the heavy trap-door, which was only laid back, fell down. The girl heard a scream, lifted up the door very quickly to go to her aid, but she had fallen down, and the girl found her lying lifeless at the bottom. And now the magnificent castle belonged to the girl alone. She at first did not know how to reconcile herself to the good fortune. Beautiful dresses were hanging in the wardrobes. The chests were filled with gold or silver, or with pearls and jewels, and she never felt a desire that she was not able to gratify. As soon as the fame of the beauty and riches of the maiden went all over the world, wooers presented themselves daily, but none pleased her. At length the son of the king came, and he knew how to touch her heart, and she was betrothed herself to him. In the garden of the castle there was a lime tree, under which they were one day sitting together, and he said to her, "I will go home and obtain my father's consent for our marriage. I entreat thee to wait for me here under this lime tree. I shall be back with thee in a few hours." The maiden kissed him on his left cheek and said, "Keep true to me, and never let anyone else kiss thee on the cheek. I will wait here under the lime tree until thou returnest." Hey, Papa. The maid stayed beneath the lime tree until sunset, but he did not return. She sat 3 days from morning till evening, waiting for him, but in vain. As he still was not there by the 4th day, she said, "Some accident has surely befallen him. I will go out and seek him, and will not come back until I have found him." She packed up 3 of her most beautiful dresses, one embroidered with bright stars, the second with silver moons, and the third with golden suns, tied up a handful of jewels in a handkerchief, and set out. She inquired everywhere for her betrothed, but no one had seen him. No one knew anything about him. Far and wide did she wander through the world, but she found him not. At last she hired herself to a farmer as a cowherd, and buried her dresses and jewels beneath a stone. And now she lived as a herdswoman, guarded her herd, and was very sad and full of longing for her beloved one. She had a little calf which she taught to know her, and fed it out of her own hand. And when she said, little calf, kneel by my side, do not forget thy shepherd maid, as the prince forgot his betrothed bride, who waited for him 'neath the lime tree shade. The little calf would kneel down, and she'd stroke it. And when she had lived for a couple years alone and full of grief, a report was spread all over the land that the king's daughter was about to celebrate her marriage. The road to town passed through the village where the maiden was living, and it came to pass that once when the maiden was driving out of her herd, her bridegroom traveled by. He was sitting proudly on his horse, and never looked around. But when she saw him, she recognized her beloved, and it was just as if a sharp knife had pierced her heart. "Alas," she said, "I believe him true to me, but he has forgotten me." Next day he came again along the road. When he was near her, she said to the little calf, little calf, kneel by my side, and do not forget thy shepherd maid, as the prince forgot his betrothed bride, who waited for him 'neath a lime tree shade." When he was aware of the voice, he looked down and reined his horse. He looked into the herd's face, and then put his hands before his eyes, as if he were trying to remember something. But he soon rode onwards and was out of sight. "Alas," she said,
He no longer knows me.
And her grief was even greater. Soon after this, a great festival, 3 days long, was to be held at the king's court, and the whole of the country was invited.
Now I will try my last chance,
thought the maiden. When evening came, she went to the stone under which she had buried her treasures. She took out the dress with the golden suns and put it on, and adorned herself with the jewels. She let down her hair, which she had concealed under her handkerchief, and it fell down in long curls about her, and thus she went into town, and in the darkness was observed by no one. When she entered the brightly lighted hall, everyone started back in amazement, but no one knew who she was. The king's son went to meet her, but he did not recognize her. He led her out to dance, and was so enchanted with her beauty that he thought no more of the other bride. When the feast was over, she vanished in the crowd, and hastened before daybreak to the village, where she once more put on her herd's dress. The next evening she took out the dress with the silver moons, and put a half-moon made of precious stones in her hair. When she appeared at the festival, all eyes were turned on her. But the king's son hastened to meet her, and filled with love for her, princes, danced with her alone, and no longer so much as glanced at anyone else. Before she went away, she was forced to promise him to come again to the festival on the last evening. When she appeared for the third time, she wore the star dress, which sparkled at every step she took, and her hair ribbon and girdle were starred with jewels. The prince had already been waiting for her a long time, and forced his way up to her. "Do but tell me who thou art," he said. "I feel as if I have already known you a long time." Princes.
Dost thou not know what I did when thou leftest me?
She stepped up to him and kissed him on his left cheek, and in a moment it was as if the scales fell from his eyes, and he recognized the true bride. "Come," he said to her, "here I stay no longer," gave her his hand, and led her down to the carriage. The horses hurried away to the magic castle as if the wind had been harnessed to the carriage. The illuminated windows already shone in the distance. When they drove past the lime tree, countless glowworms were swarming about it. It shook its branches and sent forth their fragrance. On the steps, flowers were blooming, and the room echoed with the long songs of strange birds. But in the hall the entire court was assembled, and the priest was waiting to marry the bridegroom to his true bride. So, story elements from other stories often end up in other stories. So, that was almost Cinderella. Almost. It was almost The Good Daughter. But it wasn't. That is why I like fairy tales. The more places they go, the more altered the story becomes. next one is another one I get to do fun voices for. And I really don't sing very well. At least not very often. Papa Penguin, glad you came in. Okay. I don't know if the ads are running, so... Ah, you got a Rowlet? Cool. Okay. So... Dang it. Chocolate-covered coffee beans, I got coffee grounds in my mouth, so... It's weird. Ugh. Need more coffee beans. Wish I didn't look like a spasm when I put something in my mouth. Okay. So, our next story for the evening Rumpelstiltskin from the Blue Fairy book. There was once upon a time a poor miller who had a very beautiful daughter. Now, it happened one day that he had an audience with the king, and in order to appear as a person of some importance, he told him that he had a daughter who could spin straw into gold. "Now that's a talent worth having," said the king to the miller. "If your daughter is as clever as you say, bring her to my palace tomorrow, and I'll put her to the test." When the girl was brought to him, he led her into a room full of straw, gave her a spinning wheel and a spindle, and said, "Now, set to work and spin all night till early dawn. If by that time you haven't spun the straw into gold, you shall die." Then he closed the door behind him and left her alone inside. So, the poor miller's daughter sat down and didn't know what in the world she was to do. She hadn't the least idea how to spin straw into gold, and became at last so miserable that she began to cry. Suddenly, the door opened, and in stepped a tiny little man, and said, "Good evening, Miss Miller Maid. Why are you crying so bitterly?" "Oh," cried the girl, "I have to spin the straw into gold, and I haven't a notion how it's done." "What will you give me if I spin it for you?" asked the mannequin. "My necklace," replied the girl. The little man took the necklace, sat himself down at the wheel, and whir, the wheel went around 3 times, and the bobbin was full. Then he put on another, and whir, the wheel went around 3 times, and the second, too, was full. And so it went on until morning, when all the straw was spun away. and all the bobbins were full of gold. As soon as the sun rose, the king came, and when he perceived the gold, he was astonished and delighted, but his heart only lusted more than ever after the precious metal. He had the miller's daughter put into another room full of straw, much bigger than the first, and bade her, if she valued her life, spin it all into gold before the following morning. The girl didn't know what to do and began to cry. Then the door opened as before, and the tiny little man appeared and said,
"What will you give me if I spin the straw into gold for you?"
The ring from my finger," answered the girl. The mannikin took the ring, and whirr! Round went the spinning wheel again. And when morning broke, he had spun all the straw into glittering gold. The king was pleased beyond measure at the sights, but his greed for gold was still not satisfied, and he had the miller's daughter brought into yet a bigger room full of straw, and said, "You must spin all this away into the night, but if you succeed this time, you shall become my wife." She's only a Mildred's daughter, it's true, he thought, but I couldn't find a richer wife if I were to search the whole world over. When the girl was alone, the little man appeared for the third time, and said,
"What will you give me if I spin the straw into gold for you once again?"
"I've nothing more to give," answered the girl.
"Then promise me you and your queen will give me your first child."
"Who knows what may happen before that?" thought the miller's daughter, and besides, she saw no other way out of it. So she promised the mannikin what he demanded, and he set to work once more, and spun the straw into gold. When the king came in the morning and found everything as he had desired, he straightway made her his wife, and the miller's daughter became a queen. When a year had passed, a beautiful son was born to her, and she thought no more of the little man, till all of a sudden, one day, he stepped into her room and said,
"Now give me what you promised."
The queen was in a great state, and offered the little man all the riches in her kingdom if he would only leave her the child. But the mannikin said,
"No, a living creature is dearer to me than all the treasures in the world."
Then the queen began to cry and sob so bitterly that the little man was sorry for her, and said,
"I'll give you 3 days to guess my name. If you find it out in that time, you may keep your child."
Then the queen pondered the whole night over all the names she had ever heard, and sent a messenger to scour the land, and to pick up far and near any names he could come across. When the little man arrived on the following day, she began with Caspar, Melchior, Belshazzar, and all the other names she knew, in a string. But at each one the little mannikin called out,
"That's not my name." Yeah.
The next day she went to inquire the names of all the people in the neighborhood, and had a long list of the most uncommon and extraordinary names. And then the little man, when he made his appearance,
Is your name perhaps Sheepshanks, Crookshanks, Spindleshanks? But he always replied, yeah, that's not my name. On the third day, the messenger returned and announced, I've not been able to find any new names, but I came upon a high hill round the corner of the wood where the foxes and hares bid each other good night. I saw a little house, and in front of the house burned a fire, and around the fire sprang the most grotesque little man, hopping on one leg and crying, Tomorrow I boot, today I bake, and when the girl comes I'll take it. For little deems my royal dame, the Rumpelstiltskin is my name. You can imagine the queen's delight at hearing the name. And when the little man stepped in shortly afterward and asked, Now, my lady queen, what's my name? She asked first, Is your name Conrad? No. Is your name Harry? No. Is your name perhaps Rumpelstiltskin? Some demon told you that! Some demon has told you that! Screamed the little man, and in his rage drove his right foot so far into the ground that it sank up to his waist. Then, in a passion, he seized his left foot with both hands and tore himself in two. Okay, I had fun with that one. Rumpelstiltskin! Okay. Yeah. Anyway. Real question is, what would a demon know his name? Anyway. The next story. Princess Minon-Minette. From the Pink Fairy book. Once upon a time there lived a young king whose name was Saucy, and he had been brought up, ever since he was a baby, by the fairy Constancy. Now, the fairy Girouette had a kind heart, but she was a very trying person to live with. Fairies. For she never knew her own mind for 2 minutes together. And as she was the sole ruler at court till the prince grew up, everything was always at 6s and 7s. At first, she determined to follow the old custom of keeping the young king ignorant of the duties he would have to perform someday. Then, quite suddenly, she resigned the reins of the government into his own hands. But unluckily, it was too late to train him properly for the post. However, the fairy did not think of that, but carried away by her new ideas, she hastily formed a council, and named as Prime Minister the excellent Ditto, so called because he never had been known to contradict anybody. The young Prince Saucy had a handsome face, and at the bottom a good deal of common sense. But he had never been taught good manners, and was shy and awkward, and had besides never learned how to use his brains. Under these circumstances, it is not surprising that the council did not get through much work. Indeed, the affairs of the country fell in such disorder that at last the people broke out into open rebellion, and it was only the courage of the king who continued to play the flute while swords and spears were flashing before the palace gate that prevented civil war from being declared. No sooner was the revolt put down than the council turned their attention to the question of the young king's marriage. Various princesses were proposed to him, and the fairy, who was anxious to get the affair over with before she left the court forever, gave it as her opinion that the Princess Defana would make the most suitable wife. Accordingly, envoys were sent to bring back an exact report of the princess's looks and ways, and they returned saying that she was tall and well-made, but so very light that the equerries who accompanied her in her walks had to always be watching her, lest she should suddenly be blown away. This happened so often that her subjects lived in terror of losing her forever, and tried everything they could think of to keep her on the ground. They even suggested that she should carry weights in her pockets, or have them tied to her ankles. But this idea was given up, as the princess found it uncomfortable. At length, it was decided that she was to never go out in a wind, and in order to make matters sure, still the equerries each held the end of a string, which was fastened to her waist. The council talked over this report for some days, and then the king made up his mind that he would judge for himself, and pretend to be his own ambassador. This plan was by no means new, but it had often succeeded, and, anyhow, they could think of nothing better. Such a splendid embassy had never been seen before in any country. The kingdom was left in charge of the prime minister, who answered ditto to everything. But the choice was better than it seemed, for the worthy man was much beloved by the people, and he agreed with all they said, and they left him feeling very pleased with themselves and their own wisdom. When the king arrived at Defana's court, he found a magnificent reception waiting for him. For though they pretended not to know who he was, secrets like this are never really hid. And now the young king had a great dislike to long ceremonies, so he proposed that his second interview with the princess should take place in the garden. The princess made some difficulties, but as the weather was lovely and very still, she at last consented to the king's wishes. But no sooner had they finished their bows and curtsies than a slight breeze sprung up and began to sway the princess, whose equerries the equerries retired out of respect. The king went forward to steady her, but the wind that he caused only drove her further away from him. He rushed after her, exclaiming, "Oh, princess! Are you really running away from me?"
"Oh, gracious, no," she replied. "Run a little quicker and you will be able to stop me, and I shall be forever grateful." "That is what comes from talking in the garden," she added with disgust. "As if it wasn't one much better than a room that was tightly closed all around."
The king ran as fast as he could, but the wind ran faster still, and in a moment the princess was whirled to the bottom of the garden, which was bounded by a ditch. She cleared it like a bird,
and the king, who was obliged to stop short at the edge, saw the lovely Diaphana flying over the plain, sometimes driven to the right, sometimes to the left, till she vanished out of sight. By this time, the whole court was running over the plain, some on foot, some on horseback, all hurrying to help their princess, who really was in some danger, for the wind was rising to the force of a gale. The king looked on for a little, and then returned with his attendants to the palace, reflecting all the while of the extreme lightness of his proposed bride, and to the absurdity of having a wife that rose in the air better than a kite. The absurdity of it. The whole thought that it would be wiser not to wait longer, but to depart at once. He started on horseback at the very moment when the princess had been found by her followers, wet to the skin and blown against a rick. Soucy met the courage which was bringing her home, and stopped to congratulate her on her escape, and to advise her to put on some dry clothes. Then he continued his journey. It took a good while for the king to get home again, and he was rather cross at having had such trouble for nothing. Besides which, his courtiers made fun of his adventure, and he did not like being laughed at. Though, of course, they did not dare do it before his face. At the end of it, it was very soon that he started on his travels again, only allowing one equerry to accompany him, and even this attendant he managed to lose the moment he had left his own kingdom behind him. Now, it was the custom in those days for princes and princesses to be brought up by fairies, who loved them as their own children, and did not mind what inconvenience they put other people to for their sakes, for all the world as if they had been the real mothers. Now, the fairy Aveline, who lived in a country that touched at one point the kingdom of King Soucy, had under her care the lovely princess Minon-Minette, and had made up her mind to marry her to the young king, who, in spite of his awkward manners, which, could be improved, was really much nicer than most of the young men she was likely to meet. So, Aveline made her preparations accordingly, and began by arranging that the equerry should lose himself in the forest, after which she took away the king's sword and his horse while he lay asleep under a tree. Her reason for this was that she felt persuaded that, finding himself suddenly alone and robbed of everything, the king would hide his real birth, and would have to fall back on his powers of pleasing, like other men, which would be much better for him. When the king awoke and found that the tree to which he had tied his horse had its lowest branches broken, and that nothing living was in sight, he was much dismayed, and sought high and low for his lost treasure, but all in vain. After a time he began to get hungry, so he decided that he had better try to find his way out of the forest, and perhaps he might have a chance of getting something to eat. He had only gone a few steps when he met Aveline, who had taken the shape of an old woman with a heavy bundle of faggots on her back. She staggered along the path and almost fell at his feet, and Soucy, afraid that she might have hurt herself, picked her up and set her on her feet again, before passing on his way. But he was not to be let off so easily.
"What about my bundle?" cried the old woman. "Where is your politeness? Really, you seem to have been very nicely brought up. What have they taught you?"
"Taught me? Nothing," replied he.
"I can believe it well," she said. "You don't even know how to pick up a bundle." Oh, you can come near. I'm cleverer than you, and know how to pick up a bundle very well.
The king blushed at her words, which he felt had a great deal of truth in them, and took up the bundle meekly. Aveline, delighted at her success of this first experiment, hobbled along after him, chattering all the while, as old women do.
I wish, she said, that all kings had done as much in their lives. Then they would know what a lot of trouble it takes to get wood for their fires.
Sousie felt this to be true, and was sorry for the old woman. "Where are we going to?" he asked.
To the castle of the White Demon, and if you are in want of work, I will find something to do.
"But I can't do anything," he said, "except carry a bundle, and I shan't earn much by that."
Oh, but you are learning,
replied the old woman,
and it isn't bad for a first lesson.
But the king was paying very little attention to her, for he was rather cross and very tired. Indeed, he felt that he really could not carry the bundle any further, and was about to lay it down, when up came a young maiden, more beautiful than the day, and covered in precious stones. She ran to them, exclaiming to the old woman,
"Oh, you poor thing! I was just coming after you to see if I could help you." "Here is a young man," replied the old woman, "who will be quite ready to give you up the bundle. See, he does not look like he enjoyed carrying it."
"Will you let me take it, sir?" she asked. The king felt ashamed of himself, and held on to it tightly, while the presence of the princess put him in a better temper. So they all traveled together till they arrived at an ordinary-looking house, which Aveline pointed out as the castle of the White Demon, and told the king that he might put down his bundle in the courtyard. The young man was terribly afraid of being recognized by someone in this strange position, and would have turned on his heel and gone away had it not been for the thought of Minon-Minette. Still, he felt very awkward and lonely, for both the princess and the old woman had entered the castle without taking the slightest notice of the young man, who remained where he was for some time, not quite knowing what he had better do. At length a servant arrived and led him into a beautiful room filled with people, who were playing either on musical instruments or talking in a lively manner, which astonished the king, who stood silently listening, and not at all pleased the want of attention paid him. Matters went on this way for some time. Every day the king felt more and more in love with Minon-Minette, and every day the princess seemed more and more taken up with other people. At last, in despair, the prince sought out the old woman to try to get some advice from her as to his conduct, or, anyway, to have the pleasure of talking to Minon-Minette. He found her spinning in an underground chamber, but quite ready to tell him all he wanted to know. In answer to his questions, he learned that in order to win the hand of a princess, it was not enough to be born a prince, for she would marry nobody who had not proved himself faithful, and had, besides, all those talents and accomplishments which help to make people happy. For a moment, Sousie was very much cast down on hearing this, but then he plucked up. "Tell me what I must do in order to win the heart of the princess, and no matter how hard it is, I will do it." And Show me how I can repay you for your kindness, and you shall have anything I can give you. Shall I bring in your bundle of faggots every day?
It is enough that you should have made the offer,
replied the old woman, and she added, holding out a skein of thread.
Take this. One day you will be thankful for it, and when it becomes useless, your difficulties will be past.
Is it the skein of my life? He asked.
It is the skein of your love's ill luck, she said.
And he took it and went away. Now, Farragut, who had brought up Sousie, had an old friend called Grimace, the protectress of Prince Fruit. Grimace often talked over the young prince's affairs with Girouette, and when she decided that he was old enough to govern his own kingdom, consulted Girouette as to a suitable wife. Girouette, who never stopped to think or make inquiries, drew such a delightful picture of Minon-Minette that Grimace determined to spare no pains to bring about the marriage, and accordingly Fluette was presented at court. But, though the young man was pleasant and handsome, the princess thought him rather womanish in some ways, and displayed her opinion so openly as to draw upon herself and Aveline the anger of the fairy, who declared that Minon-Minette should never know happiness till she had found a bridge under an arch, without an arch, and a bird without feathers. So saying, she went away. Before the king set out afresh on his travels, Aveline had restored him to his horse and his sword, and though these were but small consolations of the absence of the princess, they were better than nothing, for he felt that somehow they might be the means of leading him back to her. After crossing several deserts, the king arrived at length in a country that seemed inhabited. But the instant he stepped over the border, he was seized and flung into chains, and dragged at once to the capital. He asked his guards why he was treated like this, but the only answer he got was that he was in the territory of the Iron King. For in those days, countries had no names of their own. They were named after their rulers. The young man was led into the presence of the Iron King, who was seated on a black throne, and a hall also hung with black, as a token of mourning for all relations whom he had put to death. "What are you doing in my country?" he cried fiercely. "I came here by accident," replied Sousie, "and if I ever escape from your clutches, I will take warning by you and treat my subjects differently." "Do you dare to insult me in my own court?" cried the king. "Away with him to Little Ease." That could be interesting as Blood Moon. Now, Little Ease was an iron cage hung by 4 thick chains in the middle of a great vaulted hall, and the prisoner inside could neither sit, nor stand, nor lie, and, besides that, he was made to suffer by turns unbearable heat and cold, while the heavy 100 bolts kept everything safe. Girouette, whose business it was to see after Sousie, had kind of forgotten his existence in the excitement of some new idea, and he would not have been alive long to trouble anyone if Aveline had not come to the rescue and whispered in his ear, "And the skein of thread?" He took it up immediately, and though he did not see how it could help him, but he tied it round one of the iron bars of his cage, which seemed to be the only thing he could do, and he gave it a pull. To his surprise, the bar gave way at once, and he found that he could break it into 1,000 pieces. After this, it did not take him long to get out of his cage, or to treat the closely barred windows in the hall in the same manner. But even after he had done this, all his freedom appeared as far from him as ever, for between him and the open country was a high wall, and so smooth that not even a monkey could climb it. Then the Sousee's heart died within him. He saw nothing for it but to submit to some horrible death. But he determined that the Iron King should not profit more than he could help, and flung his precious thread into the air, saying, as he did so, "Oh, Fairy, my misfortunes are greater than your power. I am grateful for your goodwill, but take your gift back." The fairy had pity on his youth and want of faith, and took care that one end of the thread remained in his hand. He suddenly felt a jerk, and saw that the thread must have caught on something, and this thought filled him with a daring that was born from despair. "Better," he said to himself, "to trust the thread than to the mercies of the king." And, gliding down, he found himself safe on the other side of the wall. Then he rolled up the thread and put it carefully into his pocket, breathing silent thanks to the fairy. Now, Minon-Minette had been kept informed by Aveline of the prince's adventures, and when she heard of the way in which he had been treated by the Iron King, she became furious and began to prepare for war. She made her plans with all the secrecy she could, but when great armies are collected, people are apt to suspect a storm is brewing. And, of course, it is very difficult to keep anything hidden from fairy godmothers. Anyway, Grimness soon heard of it, and as she had never forgiven Minon-Minette for refusing Prince Foot, she felt that here was her chance for revenge. Up to this time, Aveline had been able to put a stop to many of Grimace's spiteful tricks, and to keep guard over Minon-Minette. But she had no power over anything that happened at a distance. And when the princess declared her intention of putting herself at the head of her army, and began to train herself to bear fatigue by hunting daily, the fairy entreated her to be careful never to cross the border of her dominions without Aveline to protect her. The princess at once gave her promise, and all went well for some days. Unluckily, one morning, as Minon-Minette was cantering slowly on the boundaries of her kingdom, of which, indeed, she was kind of ignorant, she suddenly found herself in front of the house made entirely of dead leaves, which somehow brought all sorts of unpleasant things to her head. She remembered Aveline's warning and tried to turn her horse, but it stood as still as if it had been marble. Then the princess felt that she was slowly, and against her will, being dragged to the ground. She shrieked and clung tightly to the saddle, but it was all in vain. She longed to fly, but something outside herself proved too strong for her, and she was forced to take the path that led to the house of dead leaves. Scarcely had her feet touched the threshold than Grimace appeared. "So here you are at last, Minon-Minette. I have been watching you for a long time, and my trap was ready for you from the beginning. Come here, my darling. I will teach you to make war on friends. Things won't turn out exactly as you fancied. What you have got to do now is to go on your knees to the king and crave his pardon. And before he consents to a peace, you will have to implore him to grant you the favor of becoming his wife. Meanwhile, you will have to be my servant. From that day, the poor princess was put to the hardest and dirtiest work, and each morning something more disagreeable seemed to await her. Besides which, she had no food but a little black bread, and no bed but a little straw. Out of pure spite, she was sent in the heat of the day to look after geese, and would most likely have gotten sunstroke if she had not happened to pick up in the fields a large fan, with which she sheltered her face. To be sure, a fan seems a rather odd possession for a goose girl, but the princess did not think of that, and she forgot all her troubles when, on opening the fan to use it as a parasol, out tumbled a letter from her lover. Then she felt sure that the fairy had not forgotten her, and took heart. When Grimace saw that the Minon-Minette still managed to look as white as snow, instead of being burnt as brown as a berry, she wondered what could have happened, and began to watch her closely. The following day, when the sun was at its highest and hottest, she noticed her draw a fan from the folds of her dress and hold it before her eyes. The fairy, in a rage, tried to snatch it from her, but the princess would not let it go. "Give me that fan at once!" cried Grimace. "Never while I live!" answered the princess, and, not knowing where it would be safest, placed it under her feet. In an instant she felt herself rising from the ground, with the fan always beneath her, and while Grimace was much too blinded by her fury to notice what was going on, the princess was quickly soaring out of reach. All this time, Soucy had been wandering through the world with his precious thread carefully fastened around him, seeking every possible and impossible place where his beloved princess might chance to be. But though he sometimes found traces of her, or even messages scratched on a rock, or cut in the bark of a tree, she herself was nowhere to be found. "If she is not on earth," said Soucy to himself, "perhaps she is hiding somewhere in the air. It is there I shall find her." So, by the help of his thread, he tried to mount upwards, but he could only go such a little way, and hurt himself dreadfully when he tumbled back down to earth again. Still, he did not give up, and after many days of efforts and tumbles, he found, to his great joy, that he could go a little higher and stay up a little longer than he did the day before, and by he was able to live in the air altogether. But, alas, the world of the air seemed empty of her as the world below. And Soucy was beginning to despair, and to think that he must go and search the world that lay in the sea. He was floating sadly along, not paying any heed to where he was going, when he saw in the distance a beautiful, bright sort of bird coming towards him. His heart beat fast. He did not know why. And as they drew near, the voice of his princess exclaimed, "Behold, the bird without feathers and the bridge without an arch!" So, their first meeting took place in the air, but it was none less happy for that. and the fan grew big enough to hold the king as well as Aveline, who had fastened to give them some good advice. She guided the fan above the spot where the two armies lay encamped before each other, ready to give battle. The fight was long and bloody, but in the end the Iron King was obliged to give way and surrender to the princess, who set him to keep King Saucy's sheep, first making him swear a solemn oath that he would treat them kindly. Then the marriage took place, in the presence of Girouette, whom they had the greatest trouble to find, and who was much astonished to discover how much business had been got through her absence. Bloody freaking fairy. So, princes and princesses were raised by fairies. Good to know. Well, that was definitely a convoluted story. I like convolutions. I think it's stretching. The Beauty and the Beast would make for an interesting Bloodborne story. Antenna? Oh well. Yep. I'm stretched and hydrated, and now I should continue. Okay. The next story An Impossible Enchantment, as found in the Grey Fairy book. There once lived a king who was much loved by his people, and he too loved them warmly. He led a very happy life, but he had the greatest dislike to the idea of marrying. Nor had he ever felt the slightest wish to fall in love. His subjects begged him to marry, and at last he promised to try to do so. But as, so far, he had never cared for any woman he had seen, he made up his mind to travel in hopes of meeting some lady he could love. He arranged all the affairs of state in an orderly manner and set out, attended by only one equerry, who, though not very clever, had most excellent good sense. These people indeed generally make the best fellow travelers. Now, the king explored several countries, doing all he could to fall in love, but in vain. And at the end of 2 years' journey, he faced his face towards home, with a heart as free as when he set out. He was riding along through the forest, and he suddenly heard the most awful meowing, shrieking of cats you could ever imagine. The noise drew nearer and nearer, and at last they saw 100 huge Spanish cats rush through the trees close to them. They were so closely packed together that you could easily have covered them with a large cloak. and all were following the same track. They were closely pursued by two enormous apes, dressed in purple suits with the prettiest and best-made boots you ever saw. Crimson leather. The apes were mounted on superb mastiffs, and spurred them on in hot haste, blowing shrill blasts on toy trumpets the whole time. The king and his equerries stood still to watch this strange hunt, which was followed by 20 or more little dwarfs, some mounted on wolves and leading rallies, and the others with cats and leashes. The dwarves were all dressed in purple silk liveries, like the apes. A moment later, a beautiful young woman mounted on a tiger came in sight. She came close to the king, riding at full speed, without taking any notice of him. But he was at once enchanted by her, and his heart was gone in a moment. To his great joy, he saw that one of the dwarfs had fallen behind the rest, and at once began to question him. The dwarf told him that the lady he had just seen was the Princess Minon-Minette, the daughter of the king whose country they were in at the moment. He added that the princess was very fond of hunting, and that she was now in pursuit of rabbits. The king then asked the way to the court, and having been told it, hurried off, and reached the capital in a few hours. As soon as he arrived, he presented himself to the king and queen, and on mentioning his own name and that his country was received with open arms. Not long after, the princess returned, and hearing that the hunt had been very successful, the king complimented her on it, but she would not answer a word. Her silence rather surprised him, but he was still astonished when he found out that she never spoke once all through supper time. Sometimes she seemed about to speak, but whenever this was the case, her father or mother at once took up the conversation. However, the silence did not cool the king's affection, and when he retired to his rooms that night, he confided his feelings to his faithful equerry. But the equerry was by no means delighted at his king's love affair, and took no pains to hide his disappointment. "But why are you vexed?" answered the king. "Surely the princess is beautiful enough to please anyone." "She is very handsome," replied the equerry. "But to be really happy in love is something more than beauty is required. To tell you the truth, sire," he added, "her expression seems to be hard." "That is pride and dignity," said the king. "Can nothing be more becoming?" "Pride or hardness, as you will," said the equerry. "But to my mind the choice of so many fierce creatures for her amusements seems to tell of a fierce nature, and I also think there is something suspicious in the care taken to prevent her from speaking." The equerry's remarks were full of good sense, but as opposition is only apt to increase love in the hearts of men, and especially of kings who hate being contradicted, the king begged, the very next day, for the hand of Princess Minon-Minette, and it was granted him on two conditions. The first was that the wedding should take place the very next day, and the second, that he should not speak to the princess till she was his wife. To all of this the king agreed, and in spite of his equerry's objections, so that the first word he heard his bride utter was the "yes," she spoke of their marriage. Why do? Once married, however, she no longer placed any check on herself, and her ladies-in-waiting came in for plenty of rude speeches. Even the king did not escape scolding. But as he was a good-tempered man and very much in love, he bore it patiently. A few days after the wedding, the newly married pair set out for their kingdom without leaving many regrets behind. The good Equeror's fears proved only too true, as the king found out to his cost. The young queen made herself most disagreeable to all her court. Her spite and her bad temper knew no bounds, and before the end of the month, she was known far and wide as a regular vixen. One day, when riding out, she met a poor old woman walking along the road, who made a curtsy and was going on, when the queen had her stopped and cried, "Ah, you a very impertinent person. Don't you know that I'm the queen? How dare you not make a deeper curtsy?" "Madam," said the old woman, "I have never learned how to measure curtsies, but I had no wish to fail in proper respect." "What?" cried the queen. "She dares to answer? Tie her to my horse's tail, and I'll just carry her at once to the best dancing master in the town to be learn how to curtsy." The old woman shrieked for mercy, but the queen would not listen, and only mocked when she said she was protected by the fairies. At last the poor old thing submitted to be tied up, and when the queen urged her horse on, he never stirred. In vain she spurred him. He seemed to turn to bronze. At the same moment, the cord with which the woman was tied changed into a wreath of flowers, and she herself into a tall and stately lady. Looking disdainfully at the queen, she said, "Bad woman, unworthy of your crown, I wish to judge for myself whether I heard was true as you. I have no doubt of it, and you shall see whether the fairies are to be laughed at." Oopsie. So saying, the fairy, Placida, that was her name, blew a little gold whistle, and a chariot appeared drawn by 6 splendid ostriches. In it was seated the fairy queen, escorted by a dozen of fairies mounted on dragons. All having dismounted, Placida told her adventures, and the fairy queen approved all she had done, and proposed turning Motimosa into bronze like her horse. Placida, however, who was very kind and gentle, begged for a milder sentence, and at last it was settled that Mutinosa should become her slave for life, unless she should have a child to take her place. The king was told of his wife's fate and submitted to it, which, as he could do nothing to help, was the only course open to him. The fairies then all dispersed, Placidia taking her slave with her, and on reaching her palace she said, "You ought by rights to be a scullion, but as you have been delicately brought up, the change might be too great for you. I shall therefore only order you to sweep my rooms carefully, and to wash and comb my little dog." Mutinosa felt that there was no use in disobeying, so she did as she was bid, and said nothing. After some time she gave birth to a most lovely little girl, and when she was again well, the fairy gave her a good lecture on her past life, and made her promise to behave better in the future, and sent her back to the king, her husband. Placida now gave herself up entirely to the little princess who was left in her charge. She anxiously thought over which of the fairies she would invite to be the godmothers, so as to secure the best gifts for her adopted child. At last, she decided two very kindly and cheerful fairies, and asked them to the christening feast. Directly it was over, the baby was brought to them in a lovely crystal cradle, hung in red silk curtains embroidered with gold. The little things smiled so sweetly at the fairies that they decided to do all they could for her. They began by naming her Griselia, and then Placida said, "You know, my dear sisters, that the commonest form of spite or punishment amongst us is of changing beauty to ugliness, cleverness to stupidity, and oftener still to change a person's form altogether. Now, as we can only each bestow one gift, I think the best plan will be for one of you to give her the beauty, the other good understanding, whilst I will undertake that she shall never be changed into any other forms." The two godmothers quite agreed, and as soon as the little princess had received their gifts, they went home, and Placida gave herself to the child's education. She succeeded so well with it that little Griselia grew so lovely, and when she was still quite a child, her fame was spread only about much, and one day Placida was surprised by a visit of the Fairy Queen, who was attended by a very grave and severe-looking fairy. The Queen began at once. "I have been much surprised by your behavior to Mutinosa. She had insulted our whole race and deserved punishment. You might forgive your own wrongs if you choose, but not those of others. You treated her very gently whilst she was with you, and I come now to avenge our wrongs on her daughter. You have ensured her being lovely and clever, and not subject to change of form. But I shall place her in an enchanted prison, which she shall never leave till she finds herself in the arms of a lover whom she herself loves. It will be in my care to prevent anything of the kind happening." The enchanted prison was a large high tower in the midst of the sea, built out of shells of all shapes and colors. The lower floor was like a great bathroom, where the waters led in and out at will. The first floor contained the princess's apartment, beautifully furnished. On the second was a library, a large wardrobe filled with beautiful clothes, and every kind of linen, a music room, a pantry with bins full of the best wines, and a storeroom with all manner of preserves, bonbons, pastries, and cakes, all of which remained as fresh as if just out of the oven. Can I get a person, please? The top of the tower was laid out like a garden, with beds of the loveliest flowers, fine fruit trees, and shady arbors and shrubs where many birds sang among the branches. The fairies escorted Griselia and her governess, Bonetta, to the tower, and then mounted a dolphin which was waiting for them. At a little distance from the tower, the queen waved her wand and summoned 2,000 great fierce sharks, whom she ordered to keep a close guard and not let a soul enter the tower. The good governess took such pains with Griselia's education that when she was nearly grown up, she was not only the most accomplished, but a very sweet good girl. One day, as the princess was standing on the balcony, she saw the most extraordinary figure rise out of the sea. She quickly called Minette to ask her what it could be. It looked like some kind of man, with a bluish face and long sea-green hair. He was swimming towards the tower, but the sharks took no notice of him.
"It must be a merman,"
said Bonita.
"A man, do you say?" cried Grazilia. "Let us hurry down to the door and see him nearer."
When they stood in the doorway, the merman stopped to look at the princess and made many signs of admiration. His voice was very hoarse and husky. But when he found that he was not understood, he took to signs. He carried a little basket made of oysters and filled with rare shells, which he presented to the princess. She took it with signs of thanks, but as it was getting dusk she retired, and the merman plunged back into the sea. When they were alone, Grazilia said to her governess,
"What a dreadful-looking creature that was! Why do those odious sharks let him come so near the tower? I suppose all men are not like him?" "No, indeed," replied Bonita. "I suppose the sharks look on him as a sort of relation, so they did not attack him."
A few days later, the two ladies heard a strange sort of music, and looking out the window, there was their merman, his head crowned with water plants, and blowing a great seashell with all his might. They went down to the tower door, and Grazilia politely accepted some coral and some other marine curiosities he had brought her. After this, he used to come every evening and blow his shell, or dive and play antics under the princess's window. She contented herself with bowing to him from the balcony, but she would not go down to the door, despite all of his science. Some days later, he came with a person of his own kind, but of another sex. Her voice was dressed with great taste, and she had a lovely voice. This new arrival induced the ladies to go down to the door. They were surprised to find that, when trying various languages, she at last spoke to them in their own, and paid Grazilia a pretty compliment on her beauty. The mermaid noticed that the lower floor was full of water.
"Why,"
cried she,
"that is just the place for us, for we can't live quite out of water."
So saying, she and her brother swam in and took up a position in the bathroom. The princess and her governess seated themselves on the steps which ran around the room. True.
"No doubt, madam," said the mermaid, "you have given up living on land as to escape the crowds of lovers. But I fear that even here you cannot avoid them, for my brother is already dying of love for you, and I am sure that once you are seen in our city, he will have many rivals."
Then she went on to explain how grieved her brother was not to be able to make himself understood, adding,
"I interpret for him, having been taught several languages by a fairy." "Oh, and you have fairies too?"
asked Grazilia with a sigh.
"Yes, we have," replied the mermaid. "But if I am not mistaken, you have suffered from the fairies on earth."
The princess, on this, told her entire history to the mermaid, who assured her how sorry she felt for her, and begged her not to lose courage, adding, as she took her leave,
"Perhaps some day you will find a way out of your difficulties."
The princess was delighted with this visit, and with the hopes of the mermaid held out. It was something to meet some fresh ones to talk to.
"We will make acquaintances with several of these people," she said to her governess, "and I dare say they are not all as hideous as the first one we saw. Anyhow, we shan't be so dreadfully lonely."
"Dear me," said Bonetta, How hopeful young people are, to be sure. As for me, I feel afraid to talk to these folks. But what do you think of the lover you have captured? Oh, I could never love him, cried the princess. I can't bear him. But perhaps, as the sister says, they are related to the fairy Marina. They may be of some use to us.
The mermaid returned often, and each time she talked of her brother's love, and each time Grasilia talked of her longing to escape from her prison, till at length the mermaid promised to bring the fairy Marina to see her, in hopes she might suggest something. The next day the fairy came with the mermaid, and the princess received her with delight. After a little talk she begged Grasilia to show her the inside of the tower, and let her see the garden on top, for with the help of crutches she could manage to move around. And being a fairy, could live without water for a long time, provided she wetted her forehead now and then. Gladly Grasilia consented, and Bonita stayed below with the mermaid. When they were in the garden, the fairy said,
Let us lose no time, but tell me how I can be of use to you.
Grasilia then told her story, and Marina replied,
My dear princess, I can do nothing for you as regards the dry land, for my power does not reach beyond my own element. I can only say that if you will honor my cousin by accepting his hand, you could then come and live among us. I could teach you in a moment to swim and to dive with the best of us. I can harden your skin without spoiling its color. My cousin is one of the best matches in the sea, and I will bestow you many gifts on him, and you will be quite happy.
The fairy talked so well and so long that the princess was rather impressed, and promised to think the matter over. Just as they were going to leave the garden, they saw a ship sitting nearer the tower than any had ever done before. On the deck lay a young man under a splendid awning, gazing at the tower through a spyglass. But before they could see anything clearly, the ship moved away, and the two ladies parted, the fairy promising to return shortly. As soon as she was gone, Grasilia told her governess what she had said. Bonetta was not at all pleased at the turn the matters were taking, for she did not fancy being turned into a mermaid in her old age. She thought the matter well over, and this was what she did. She was a very clever artist, and the next morning she began to paint a picture of a handsome young man, with beautiful curly hair, a fine complexion, and lovely blue eyes. When it was finished, she showed it to Grasilia, hoping it would show her the difference there was between a fine young man and her marine suitor. The princess was much struck by the picture, and asked anxiously whether there could be any man so good-looking in the world. Bonetta assured her that there were plenty of them, indeed, and far more handsome.
I can hardly believe that, cried the princess. But alas, if there are, I don't suppose I shall ever see any of them, or they me. So what is the use? Oh dear, how unhappy I am!
Poor princess. She spent the rest of her day gazing at the picture, which certainly had the effect of spoiling all the merman's hopes and prospects. After some days, the fairy Marina came back to hear what was decided. But Grasilia hardly paid any attention to her, and showed such dislike to the idea of the proposed marriage that the fairy went off in a regular huff. Without knowing it, the princess had made another conquest. On board the ship which had sailed so near was the handsomest prince in the world. He had heard of the enchanted tower, and had determined to get near it as he could. He had strong glasses on board, and whilst looking through them, he saw the princess quite clearly, and fell desperately in love with her at once.
He wanted to steer straight for the tower and to row off in a small boat. But his entire crew fell at his feet and begged him not to run such a risk. The captain, too, urged him not to attempt it. "You will only lead us to certain death," he said. "Pray anchor nearer land, and I will then seek a kind fairy I know, who has always been most obliging to me, and who will, I'm sure, try to help your highness." The prince, rather unwillingly, listened to reason. He landed at the nearest point and sent off the captain in all haste to beg the fairy's advice and help. Meanwhile, he had a tent pitched on the shore and spent all his time gazing at the tower and looking for the princess through his spyglass. A few days after, the captain came back, bringing the fairy with him. The prince was delighted to see her and paid her great attention. "I have heard about this matter," she said, "and to lose no time, I'm going to send off a trusty pigeon to test the enchantment. If there is any weak spot, he is sure to find it out and get in. I shall bid him bring a flower back as a sign of success, and if he does so, I quite hope to get you in too." "But," asked the prince, "could I not send a line of pigeons to tell the princess my love?" "Certainly," replied the fairy. "It would be a very good plan." So, the prince wrote as follows. "Lovely princess, I adore you, and I beg you to accept my heart, and to believe there is nothing I will not do to end your misfortunes. Blondel." That is the prince's name. This note was tied around a pigeon's neck, and he flew off with it at once. He flew fast till he got near the tower, when a fierce wind blew so hard against him that he could not get on. But he was not beaten. He flew carefully around the top of the tower till he came to one spot which, by some mistake, had not been enchanted like the rest. He quickly slipped into the arbor and waited for the princess. Before long, Grasilia appeared alone, and the pigeon at once fluttered to her, and seemed so tame that she stopped to caress the pretty creature. As she did so, she saw it pluck a ribbon around its neck, and tied to the ribbon was a letter. She read it over several times, and then wrote this answer. "You say you love me, but I cannot promise to love you without seeing you. Send me your portrait by this faithful messenger. If I return it to you, you must give up hope. But if I keep it, you will know that to help me will be to help yourself. Grasilia." Before flying back, the pigeon remembered about the flower too. So, seeing one on the princess's dress, he stole it and flew back. The prince was wild with joy at the pigeon's return with the note. After an hour's rest, the trusty little bird was sent back again, carrying a miniature of the prince, which by good luck he had with him. On reaching the tower, the pigeon found the princess in the garden. She hastened to untie the ribbon, and on opening the miniature case, what she had painted for her. And to her delight, it was the very picture her governess had painted for her. She hastened to send the pigeon back, and you can fancy the prince's joy when he found that she had kept his portrait. "Now," said the fairy, "let us lose no more time. I can only make you happy by changing you into a bird, but I will take care to give you back your proper shape at the right time." The prince was eager to start, so the fairy, touching him by her wand, turned him into the loveliest hummingbird you ever saw. by the same time letting him keep the power of speech. The pigeon was told to show him the way. Garcia was much surprised to see a perfectly strange bird, and still more when it flew to her, saying,
"Good morning, sweet princess."
I can do hummingbirds. She was delighted with the pretty creature and let him perch on her finger. When he said,
"Kiss, kiss, little birdie,"
which she gladly did, petting and stroking him at the same time. After a time, the princess, who had been up very early, grew tired, and as the sun was hot, she went to lie down on a mossy bank in the shade of the arbor. She held the pretty bird near her breast, and was just falling asleep when the fairy contrived to return the prince to his own shape. So that as Grazilia opened her eyes, she found herself in the arms of a lover whom she loved in return. At the same moment, her enchantments came to an end. The tower began to rock and split. Bonetta hurried up to the top that she might at least perish with her dear princess. Just as she reached the garden, the kind fairy who had helped the prince arrived with the fairy Placida in a car of Venetian glass drawn by 6 eagles. "Come away, quickly!" they cried. "The tower is about to sink." The prince, princess, and Bonetta lost no time in stepping into the car, which rose into the air just as, with a terrible crash, the tower sank into the depths of the sea. For the fairy Marina and the merman had destroyed its foundations to avenge themselves on Grazilia. Luckily, their wicked plans were defeated, and the good fairies took their way to the kingdom of Grazilia's parents. They found that Queen Mutinosa had died some years ago, but her kind husband lived on peacefully, ruling his country well and happily. He received his daughter with great delight, and there were universal rejoicings at the return of the lovely princess. The wedding took place the very next day, and for many days after, balls, dinners, tournaments, concerts, and all sorts of amusements went on all day and all night. All the fairies were carefully invited, and they came in great state, and promised the young couple their protection and all sorts of good gifts. Prince Blondel and Princess Grazilia lived to a good age, beloved by everyone, and loving each other more and more as time went on. Ouch. Well, we came in under the 2-hour mark as usual. Somehow it happened. And now let's see if we can find some poor innocent soul to raid. Okay. If anyone has any suggestions, by all means, feel free to suggest them. I know a few people that are on right now, but as I said, I like to leave it open for suggestions. Poor unfortunate souls in pain, in need. This one longing to get thinner, this one wants to get the girl, and do I help them? Yes, indeed. Those poor unfortunate souls, so sad, so true. They come flocking to my cauldron, crying, "Spouse, or so please," and I help them. Yes, I do. Ha ha. Actually, I shouldn't be singing that song. I've got my own songs to sing. Hello, little girl. What's your rush? You're missing all the flowers. The sun won't set for hours. Take your time. Just so, little girl, hark and hush. The birds are singing sweetly. You'll miss the birds completely. You're traveling so fleetly. Grandmother first, then Miss Plump. What a delectable couple. To perfection, one brittle, one supple, one... Yeah, those are good stories. Then, of course, I'm singing songs from Into the Woods, so that doesn't help much. Let's see. I haven't seen anyone that I need to raid. Because I've got people that are just chatting, but I'm not lurking on theirs to see what they're chatting about yet. People playing Overwatch. I've got people playing Elder Scrolls. Don't know if I've got any other readers right now. Though I do have one friend who's reading the dialogue of the game he's playing. And he's still going. What is he playing anyway? He is playing... Oh, he's playing Fire Emblem. But he is about as much having fun doing voices as I do, so... So, let's... Raid Sandwich. I do have raid messages, one set up for subscribers, one set up for just followers. It only costs, I think, what, 300 pages to 200 pages to unlock the emote. So if you want to do it, you can. I mean, if you follow me, you already have that many. I think one day I went through and just gave everyone 5,000 points. So, we're going to raid Sandwich. Hopefully I spelt it right. Okay, I must have spelt it right. Yep, raid has been created. So, thank you all for coming in and listening to me ramble about fairy tales. I really try to cut back on my commentary about some of them, but princes and princesses falling in love at first sight just kind of ruffles my fur the wrong way. It always has. I don't know if it's just because I'm a fairy tale villain, well, former fairy tale villain, but the happily ever after thing just doesn't work for me very well.
That's like Rumpelstiltskin likes to do. Yeah.
I have too much fun doing that. But anyway, I'll wait until this Pokemon's caught, then I'll do the raid.
Let's see, what is it? Oh, Weedle. I don't think I have a Weedle yet. Oh, wait. No, the raid's going through anyway. Still only got 5 seconds left, I think. Oh, there it goes. Dang it.